Welcome and thank you for being here. I am Peggy Bloomer, Assistant Professor of Art and Design at Central Connecticut State University. I'm delighted to share with you a portion of my ongoing research, which explores how medical images, specifically 19th and 20th century photographs, did more than document illness. They played an active role in shaping how medicine understood, staged, and displayed the body. This talk, titled Picturing Care, Medical Photography, Embodied Knowledge, and the Social Life of Diagnosis, begins with an archival inquiry into daguerreotypes, stereoscopic images, lantern slides, early X-rays, and additional photos from the Burns Medical Photography Collection at Yale. But it is also a philosophical and cultural investigation into the deeper implications of those images. What did it mean to be a medical subject at that time? And how did photographic technologies help define what counted as legitimate medical knowledge? At its core, this project asks, how did early medical photographs shape diagnostic authority and define medical subjectivity? This inquiry aligns closely with the conference's focus on the social, historical, and cultural dimensions of medicine. I'll be arguing that medical photography was not a passive medium, but a powerful mediating practice, one that linked clinical spaces to public discourse and individual suffering to broader cultural performances of care, hygiene, and health reform. So, with that framing in mind, let's begin by situating the archive that grounds this research. To ground this research, I've been working with the Stanley B. Burns, MD, Historic Medical Photography Collection housed at Yale University's Medical Historical Library. This extraordinary archive spans the mid-19th to early 20th centuries and contains one of the most comprehensive collections of early clinical photography in the United States. What makes the Burns collection particularly compelling is that it captures a moment when photography was first being integrated into medicine, not simply as documentation, but as a tool for diagnosis, teaching, and even persuasion. It reveals a moment when the visual was being formalized as part of medical knowledge production. For this project, I focus on four primary types of material from the collection. Daguerreotypes, among the earliest photographic forms, captured individual patients in highly staged, intimate settings. These are one-of-a-kind, silver-coated plates that create a sense of presence and aura, what Walter Benjamin might describe as the photograph's ritual character. Stereoscopic images, which offer paired views of the same subject and were used with a viewing device to simulate three-dimensional depth. These were especially common in orthopedic and deformity cases, where spatial understanding of the body was critical to diagnosis and surgical planning. Lantern slides, glass transparencies projected in teaching lectures. These enabled physicians to share cases with audiences, moving the image from private consultation to public instruction, what I later discuss as a kind of civic ritual. And finally, early X-rays, which represent a technical and conceptual turning point. Unlike the other formats, X-rays visualize the internal body without surface mediation, introducing a new visual logic, what I refer to as the beginnings of algorithmic or machinic vision. All of these materials fall within the time period of 1840 to 1910, a crucial window in which photography became integrated into clinical workflows and gradually standardized as part of medical epistemology. This is also the period in which we see a shift from hand-drawn anatomical illustrations to mechanically produced and increasingly codified visual formats. Taken together, these photographs allow us to trace how visual practices help define what counted as illness, who counted as a patient, and how the body was made legible to medicine. To make sense of these photographs, not just as historical artifacts, but as active agents in shaping medical knowledge, I draw on a set of theoretical frameworks that help unpack how images operate ontologically, technologically, and socially. First, Gilbert Simondon's theory of individuation. Simondon challenges us to see technical objects not as fixed tools, but as entities in the process of becoming. Applying this to medical photographs, I understand these images as ontological events. They don't just record the body, they participate in the formation of diagnostic subjects. For example, a pre- and post-operative photograph doesn't merely illustrate change. It constructs a medical identity across time, a patient made visible through visual iteration. Second, I engage Martin Heidegger's concept of Gestell, or technological enframing. Heidegger argues that modern technology reveals the world in a particular way, as a resource or a standing reserve. In this context, medical photography participates in an epistemological shift. The body is no longer just seen, it is framed, isolated, abstracted, and subjected to a visual logic that privileges clinical interpretation over subjective experience. The patient becomes not a person but a case, an object to be revealed under controlled conditions of light, pose, and gaze. Finally, Walter Benjamin's notion of aura is crucial for understanding the aesthetic and affective dimensions of early medical photography. These images, especially daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, possess a tactile, one-of-a-kind quality that evokes presence and ritual. Unlike contemporary digital images, these photographs invite a kind of intimate looking. The careful choreography of patient and physician, the stillness of the moment, the physicality of the plate, all contribute to what Benjamin describes as the photograph's aura, its singularity, its embeddedness in a particular time, place, and ritual of care. Together, these thinkers allow us to reframe medical photographs not just as records of illness, but as material practices that produce medical meaning. They are part of a larger technological and cultural apparatus that stages what illness looks like, what care feels like, and how medicine sees. In the next section, I'll turn to specific examples from the archive to show how these photographs functioned choreographically, how they staged both authority and vulnerability through pose, gesture, and form. Now that we've outlined the archive and theoretical frameworks, I want to focus on how these photographs enact a kind of clinical choreography, a deliberate staging of the body that performs both medical authority and patient vulnerability. Across the Burns collection, we see a remarkable consistency in how patients are posed, whether captured in daguerreotypes, stereoscopic pairs, or lantern slides. The subject is never casually framed. The camera becomes an instrument of order. The patient is often stripped to reveal the site of illness, asked to stand, sit, or recline in positions that maximize legibility for a clinical eye. The lighting is controlled, the background neutral, and the body is centered, offered up to the gaze as a diagnostic surface. But these are not just aesthetic choices, they are epistemological gestures. The staging transforms the living, feeling person into a readable case. The pose becomes a form of submission to medical interpretation. In many images, the physician is also present, pointing, gesturing, holding an instrument or guiding the patient's limb, performing expertise within the visual field. These gestures serve as visual anchors, directing attention and asserting control over what is to be seen and how it is to be understood. What we're looking at, then, is not just the documentation of illness, but the performance of diagnosis. These photographs are produced under strict constraints: technical, exposure time, plate sensitivity; institutional, what conditions are deemed worthy of photographing; and cultural, what counts as appropriate bodily display. And within these constraints, a very specific clinical subject emerges, one who is visible, compliant, and ready to be interpreted. This is where Simondon's notion of individuation is particularly useful. The patient is not simply in the photograph, they are becoming a medical subject through the photograph. The clinical pose, the physician's touch, the act of being imaged, these all participate in the ontogenetic process of being made knowable by medicine. We can also see how these images communicate beyond the clinical encounter. A photograph of a child with rickets or a soldier with a surgical wound might appear in multiple settings: a surgeon's portfolio, a teaching collection, or even a public exhibition. The image thus travels, taking with it a trace of the clinical ritual from which it emerged, preserving and projecting the choreography of care. This movement from the intimate space of the clinic to the broader public sphere brings us to the next section of the talk: how medical photographs circulated and gained new meanings through lecture halls, publications, and public health campaigns. While these photographs were created in clinical settings, their impact extended well beyond the hospital or doctor's office. One of the central arguments of this project is that medical photography in the 19th century was not confined to diagnosis. It was also public, performative, and political. These images moved, and in doing so, they gathered new meanings and audiences. Many of the photographs I examined, particularly stereoscopic images and lantern slides, were not only diagnostic tools, but also didactic and promotional media. For example, stereoscopic views of orthopedic cases were often produced and distributed as part of surgical advertisements. The illusion of three-dimensionality made these images compelling evidence of medical efficacy. Surgeons used them to showcase their innovations, demonstrating before and after results in immersive form, turning the patient's body into a kind of visual proof. Similarly, lantern slides were projected in public lectures and medical classrooms. These glass slides transform private suffering into public narrative, often as part of civic health campaigns or hygienic reform movements. A case of tuberculosis, for instance, would not just be presented as a clinical condition, but as a visual warning, a lesson in contagion, cleanliness, or moral behavior. Here, the photograph is reframed as a tool of public pedagogy. This circulation expands what I've been calling the social life of medical images. Once detached from the patient, the photograph takes on new roles. It becomes a teaching device, a moral tale, a political statement. It is reproduced, edited, captioned, and reframed to serve institutional, pedagogical, and even commercial agendas. Importantly, this also complicates the question of consent and exposure. While many of these images may have originated in a therapeutic context, they quickly become part of a broader visual economy in which the subject, often vulnerable, disabled, or marginalized, is seen by many without control over their visibility. This reminds us that medical photographs are never neutral. They do not merely reflect illness or care, they actively shape how we understand bodies, who we think is deserving of treatment, and what we imagine health to look like. They are visual acts of governance, deeply entangled with the histories of disability, social reform, and the politics of visibility. In the final section, I'll briefly outline how this research contributes to several key fields: history of medicine, medical humanities, visual culture, and bioethics, and how it resonates with current debates around imaging, surveillance, and patient agency. As we step back from the images themselves, I want to briefly reflect on what this research contributes across several intersecting fields. First, in the history of medicine, this project invites us to rethink how diagnostic authority was visually constructed in the 19th century. Photography didn't simply illustrate medical knowledge. It actively helped produce it. Through careful staging, repetition, and circulation, clinical photographs reinforced who had the power to look, interpret, and define the boundaries of illness. The image became a tool of legitimation, making the physician's expertise visible while rendering the patient knowable through highly controlled forms of exposure. Second, within the field of medicine and visual culture, this work positions photography as both a clinical tool and a cultural text. These images were technical artifacts designed for diagnosis, teaching, or documentation, but they were also deeply aesthetic. They carried emotional, symbolic, and narrative weight. They helped craft a visual language of care and suffering, one that blended scientific objectivity with theatricality, spectacle, and persuasion. Medical photographs participated in broader cultural discourses about the body, health, and morality, and thus deserve to be read not just as evidence, but as images with form, style, and social function. Third, this research contributes to ongoing conversations in bioethics and medical anthropology, particularly around early tensions in consent, display, and stigma. Many of the patients pictured in these archives were poor, disabled, institutionalized, or otherwise vulnerable. While we have no clear record of their consent, their images were widely distributed, projected in lecture halls, published in medical journals, and archived for posterity. These practices raise enduring questions. Who gets to control their own visibility? How does medical authority intersect with social marginalization? And what ethical obligations do we inherit when we use or exhibit these images today? So while this project is grounded in historical analysis, its implications are contemporary. The ethical, aesthetic, and epistemological questions posed by these early photographs still echo in today's debates around AI imaging, diagnostic surveillance, and patient agency. They remind us that medical vision has always been entangled with power, and that seeing in medicine is never neutral. To conclude, I hope this presentation has offered a way to reconsider the role of 19th century medical photography, not merely as a form of documentation, but as a kind of visual choreography, a carefully constructed set of gestures that perform knowledge, authority, and care. These images do not just show us what illness looked like, they show us how bodies were staged, interpreted, and circulated as sites of both vulnerability and institutional power. By reading these photographs through the lenses of individuation, technological enframing, and aura, we begin to see just how deeply embedded clinical vision is within broader cultural, ethical, and philosophical systems. These aren't just historical curiosities, they are early participants in processes we still live with today: algorithmic diagnosis, AI-enhanced imaging, and the automation of care. In that sense, this work is not only about what we can recover from the archive, it's also about what we carry forward. These early photographs remind us that every diagnostic image has a history, and often a long social life beyond the clinic. Understanding that life can help us move more thoughtfully through the visual and ethical terrain of medicine today. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your presence. I'm truly grateful to be in conversation with so many thoughtful scholars. I'd welcome your questions, your responses, or any provocations you'd like to share.